Oh, and good evening. It's January 7th, 2025, and we're continuing our discussion collection in our Outside the Class series. Because this series from the Bible Project covers the entire TaNaK, right? The Old Testament. On TheDustyFeet.com, in the Outside the Class section, all of those source videos, they're set up for your review. Because the intent of Outside the Class is for you to listen to that in-class lecture first. All those lectures can be found in that source video playlist, because we're going to try to keep these to about 15 minutes. We want to make them easy for you to catch up on. So we're on a quest, scroll by scroll, book by book, a journey through this collection, but with a fun and different twist, on Outside the Class, on the Dusty Feet. And before we forget, if you find these kinds of podcasts useful, you need to click that subscribe button. The reminders, they just help you. But also, if these might be useful to others, that's when you click that like button, because that is how YouTube chooses to share these to more people, if they wish. So in this series, right, we're going to cover the entire TaNaK, that Old Testament. We're going to do it in the original order of this collection, the Hebrew Scriptures order. As we've gotten past the first 5, things will eventually get even more interesting. But remember, the videos we're going to be discussing, they're just the tip of the iceberg. They are part of a learning series that I highly recommend, and they can all be found on the Bible Project website. Link to that's in the description. Because we're going to ask many questions about all kinds of things. Answers? We'll see. Joshua, Yehoshua. This is part 3. So there's an interesting part as we get into this, right? When we get into this section, Tim mentions, he talks about the battle with the Canaanites, right? I want us to remember that the term can include others. For example, the land of Canaan is where God promised Abraham that he would occupy to, so everybody else inside it, they're going to be Canaanites. But also in Canaan, specific people will be referred to as Canaanites. But other people groups, they're going to be involved as well. You have the Moabites, the Hittites, the Amorites. These are all people groups inside the land of Canaan. Does that make sense? Right? Then the people groups are delineated by the gods that they followed. We talked about this before. There's no separation of church and state. They are and act the way that they do because of the gods they follow. So yes, there are several battles with different people groups inside, 2 of which are discussed in more detail. And like he said, the other ones are in consolidation over many years as those battles continued. But because these are isolated and early, these 2 seem essential in some way, shape, or form, because the first one is getting us off on the right foot, so to speak. Jericho. I sometimes think differently than Tim when he discusses these 2 battles, right, with Jericho and Ai, right, like that AI, yes? Since I tend to view things such as we want to be in their sandals. This is what we're learning from here, because it's not about them, it's about us. How we have God's faithfulness and maybe our unfaithfulness. Maybe we wear that unfaithfulness as it goes through many other unfaithful episodes in Scripture. But yes, that leads to, and I'll use the word, I'll agree with Tim here, it does lead to failure. But yeah, this battle of Jericho, it's an interesting thought process for me because, like Tim's going to talk about, it's God's faithfulness in this, and it begins still with a very passive approach. I mean, one of our challenges is that we love power. We love control. We love being that part, right? That's right. But empowerment here needs to do that differently, passively. Something to consider about this battle is that it begins very much with a passive, almost mundane approach, especially when someone is thinking about conquering. But another thing that gets me in this, and think about it, The stories that are going to come out of this that are not part of the scripture account, as in the people that survived the battle, that went out into the land and beyond. This is not about nobody getting away, the story not getting out. So this begins very differently from any other battle we've seen or seen up to this point. However, the structure of what we're seeing is not different from any other story we've seen. I mean, in this one, like we've seen, the ark is marched out in front of the people, and they follow. You know, growing up in my early churchianity days, there's always talk about, well, this is how it went. So they marched around and it weakened the ground and the walls fell in a different direction. There's an explanation. It's not unfeasible. But is that the purpose of the story, as Tim put it, yeah? Because I agree with Tim. It shows God's faithfulness. God says, we can do this. Just do it my way. And if you obey and listen to me, things can turn out really well for you. However, in the following story, we're going to learn what can happen when one doesn't heed God's instructions. And yeah, this is where I love the word unfaithful. Because what I love about the IE story is how it began before we arrived. Does that make sense? It began before we arrived. Our person, at least in this particular instance, a person decides to be unfaithful. And that unfaithfulness has a very communal effect moving forward. Because this is one of those challenging examples I like in Scripture. We have our sin. It doesn't just affect us. We sometimes believe it does, but it affects the community. And in this story scene, sometimes it's unseen, but it still does negatively affect the community. You know, I often use sports analogies here, and I'm going to use them here again, along with my favorite sport, soccer. To the rest of the world, of course, football. So you could have a player, say he's unfaithful to the team in a game, right? Today, one of the terms we would use would be throw the game, right? Cause the team to lose. But that's not known until afterwards, if ever. But in this example, he causes the game to be thrown. They lose. And it's not good. But now they must find the one who threw the game. The consequences were brutal before and after. Harsh. But you can see the effect it would have on the people. You know, this is not the first time in Israel's history that people within the community have been unfaithful to God. But for some, it is their first time that they've seen or experienced this. Because as we've seen in past stories, we sometimes overlook the stories in those first 5, which can be dealt with severely, just from a communal aspect. It's justifiably so, and it's essential. But just like in my soccer analogy, they got the rematch. This time, the undermining and unfaithfulness had been removed from the team and the community. In the game, very different ending. I think at times we see and we think of the harshness that we see sometimes that we notice in Scripture about consequences for being unfaithful to God. But at times, I don't think we sit back and look and see the more considerable communal impact. Because in battle, death, people have died in the losing part of the battle. And the consequences of unfaithfulness, that affects those innocent to the unfaithfulness. And then we wonder why Scripture provides instructions or commandments that guide us to be faithful, to avoid these consequences. So sometimes, I wonder how we look at these instructions. They say the 10 Commandments. Are we not faithful to them? Are we asking for a consequence like this? I think it's a fair thought. At least it's a point to ponder, something to discuss amongst yourselves. What happens when unfaithfulness affects the community? Let's be fair. This affects our community. This is interesting because it affected their community. Not the outside. It's not affecting those in the community around them. It's affecting them within the community. It affects their community. Or shall I say, with sandals on my feet, our community. The unfaithfulness in our community. As Tim put it at the end of the section, the point was to inherit the land. They must be obedient to God in his directions. One must be obedient and faithful to God's instructions to receive God's blessings. Remember that this has a flip side, showing that the promises, they're not all positive. The promises show that if you don't, then, well, we saw with the battle of IE, right? You get God's promises either way. So which sides of God's promises do you want to be on? The obedient, faithful side? Because it does raise an initial question about faithfulness and how that works. I'm going to use marriage as an example of something involving covenants, faithfulness, how that can look different, maybe in different cultures. Maybe people might take it. But I guess there's more of a sub-question. How important is a marriage covenant? It doesn't matter, does it? Or does it need details? Does it need consequences? What's it look like? One of the terms we consider a marriage covenant is obedience. We don't like to use the word obedient. It's a challenging word for us. When we throw it into marriage covenant with obedience, I get it in our culture, and I think it's part of the problem with our culture. Obedient to a covenant. At an uncomfortable thought in today's climate, because I think it gives us very little room to judge when we look back on these stories in Scripture, how their unfaithfulness to a covenant is reflected, and yet the scrutiny to our own, we prefer to ignore. Just another point to ponder, another thing to talk amongst yourselves. This time, bring donuts and coffee. But then you love the next section, which is smaller. It's condensed over time. And again, the people, and then we get the Gideonites who choose to follow God. Well, that's a whole nother section of discussion that we could do about how that's perceived, at least here in the beginning. Because I think it's a fair question to ask. Because, one, do they know about the results of the battle? I assume they do. So are they scared? Do they believe it? Do they understand it? Because these people, the children of Israel, they're only a little over 40 years away from Mount Sinai. But an entire generation has died. So they're, in a way, they're still pretty new to it themselves. Understanding how to follow this God? Gideonites know the power of God. Do they understand the fullness of God? Do they understand the love of God? That's an entirely different question. More things to consider. And of course, then we have the Canaanite kings, that coalition, right? How they decide to die because they don't want to give up their land. They're not there just to give it up to hand it over to an invading horde. So, consequences prevail. Tim brings up the line, as you go through this, you might look back and ask, does the violence of the story bother you? It's a valid question because we have people aligning with God and the way that the promise of God will need to unfold. Because today we love diplomacy. We love to talk about things and have peaceful resolutions. I'm not against it at all. I prefer peaceful resolutions. But for the people of the time, in a world where might makes right, this is the consequence of those particular interactions. Think about it. So I want to drop off here at this cliffhanger because I want to talk about this next section that Tim wants to talk about. It's a good question that we have to deal with here. Why does God declare war on the Canaanites in this particular piece, right? In contrast to our looking back on Jesus' words, on Yeshua's words. So I think that's going to be an interesting discussion. So, thank you for joining us for another edition of Outside the Class, as we're looking into Joshua on the Dusty Feet.